Saint Teresa saw the awkward silence. When couples live together but feel like complete strangers, there is a specific kind of loneliness that nobody warns you about. It is not the loneliness of an empty apartment or a Friday night with nowhere to go. It is the loneliness of lying next to someone and feeling nothing, of sitting across a dinner table from the person you married and running out of things to say, of reaching for their hand and realizing halfway through the motion that you do not even know if you want to anymore. That silence, that specific suffocating silence. Saint Teresa of Avila wrote about it, not with modern psychology words, not with therapy language, but with the raw honesty of a woman who had lived inside her own soul long enough to recognize every dark corner. She wrote about couples who shared a roof but had lost each other. She wrote about the spiritual danger of going through the motions of a life without ever truly inhabiting it. And what she described in the 1500s sounds like it was written yesterday, because the silence between two people who once loved each other and now just coexist is one of the oldest human wounds there is. Teresa was born in Avila, Spain, in 1515. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in 1535 at the age of 20. She was not a quiet, withdrawn mystic. She was sharp, opinionated. She had a sense of humor that her fellow sisters found alternately charming and exhausting. She also had something rare for her era. She paid extreme attention to the interior life of human relationships, and what she observed, both in the people who came to her for counsel and in her own prolonged periods of spiritual dryness, gave her a framework for understanding something modern couples spend thousands of dollars in therapy trying to name. She called it going through the motions without the soul. She called it reciting prayers without presence. And she applied that same diagnosis to marriages, to friendships, to any relationship where the form had survived but the fire had gone out. If you value documented history and spiritual insight like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, tell us in the comments what city you are hearing this from. And know that this script is researched and sourced from Teresa's own writings, specifically from her autobiography, known as the Book of Her Life, written between 1560 and 1565 under the instruction of her confessors, and from the Interior Castle, completed in 1577, a text that scholars from the Carmelite Institute in Washington, D.C., and the University of Salamanca have analyzed extensively for its precision about the stages of interior transformation. These are not secondhand summaries. These are Teresa's own observations, word by word. Now back to the story. In the Book of Her Life, Teresa describes a period in her own existence that most people find shocking when they first read it. For nearly 20 years, she writes, she lived a kind of split life. She performed her duties as a nun. She attended prayers. She kept the schedule. But inside, she felt almost nothing. She describes it as going to prayer and spending the entire hour fighting the urge to leave. She writes that the clock felt like an enemy, that she would rather do anything else than sit in that quiet and face the emptiness inside. She does not dramatize this. She does not make herself the victim of some extraordinary evil. She simply says, I was there in body and not in soul. And it lasted close to 2 decades. Now hold that image, because Teresa then turns that lens outward. In her writings and in the extensive documentation of her counseling conversations preserved by her secretary Maria de San Jose in the late 1500s, Teresa addresses couples and families directly. She identifies something she calls the great danger of familiarity without love, and she is devastatingly precise about what this looks like. 2 people can share every physical space, she writes, and still be strangers to each other's souls. They can speak all day and say nothing true. They can touch and feel no warmth. She says this is not a failure of affection alone. It is a failure of attention, of presence, of the willingness to remain curious about another person instead of deciding somewhere quietly and without announcement that you already know everything there is to know about them. That decision, she says, is where love begins to die. And here is where Teresa gets uncomfortable, because she does not let anyone off the hook. She does not say the couple drifted apart because of circumstances or bad luck or incompatibility. She says the silence grows because both people stopped choosing to look at each other. Both people started treating their relationship as a finished project rather than a living thing. And both people, usually without realizing it, began to prefer the comfort of routine over the risk of a genuine contact. Genuine contact, in Teresa's framework, means allowing yourself to be actually seen and to actually see. Not the version of your spouse you have decided exists in your head, but the actual person sitting across from you who has changed, who is still changing, who is surprised by things you think you know, who is afraid of things you have never asked about. She writes about a woman who came to her in the 1560s, a married woman from a prosperous family in Toledo. Teresa does not give her name. She calls her simply a woman of good standing. This woman had been married for 14 years. She told Teresa that she and her husband had not had a real conversation in she could not remember how long. They talked about the house, about the children, about money and meals and who was coming to visit, but nothing real, nothing that mattered. She told Teresa, "I feel like I am living with a man I met once and then forgot to keep meeting." Teresa's response to her is preserved in Maria de San Jose's notes and is almost startling in its directness. Teresa told her that the problem was not the husband. The problem was that this woman had stopped being interesting to herself. She had given up her interior life. She had stopped praying, not just formally, but in the broader sense Teresa used for prayer, which was any act of sincere attention to what was actually happening inside you. And when you stop being present to yourself, Teresa said, you become invisible to others. Not because they stop looking, but because there is nothing fully alive there to find. This is where Teresa's spiritual framework hits something that modern attachment research, specifically the work of John Gottman at the University of Washington's Love Lab from the 1980s onward, has quantified with numbers. Couples who stop making what researchers call bids for connection, small moments of reaching toward each other, experience a measurable deterioration in relationship quality within roughly 6 years. Gottman's data, drawn from over 40,000 hours of couple observation, found that emotionally disconnected couples respond to each other's bids for connection less than 33% of the time. Securely connected couples respond over 86% of the time. Teresa did not have those numbers, but she had the same observation. She wrote that every conversation, every glance, every moment of sitting together is either a small act of choosing the other person or a small act of turning away. And the turning aways accumulate, quietly, without drama, until one day you look up and the person across from you is a stranger you have agreed to share a life with. Cold, quiet, familiar. Teresa had a term for the mechanism that keeps people in this state without leaving it. She called it false peace, and she was unsparing about how seductive it is. False peace, she wrote, is the relief of not fighting. It is the ease of a life where no one demands anything from you emotionally, where you have arranged things so that the surface is smooth and no one looks underneath. It feels like rest. It feels like you have solved something. But it is, she says, the most dangerous spiritual condition a person can inhabit, because it mimics contentment while hollowing out everything real. She had seen it destroy people, not dramatically, that is the thing. No explosions, no affairs necessarily, no clear villain, just a slow dimming, a slow substitution of habit for love, until the habit is all that remains, and the people inside it have forgotten they were supposed to be there for a reason. The physical details of Teresa's world make this even sharper. The convent of the Incarnation in Avila, where she spent many years, housed over 150 nuns in 1550. It was overcrowded. It was under-resourced. The nuns received visitors in parlors separated by grills. They formed intense, complicated friendships and rivalries. They gossiped. They competed for status. And they also, many of them, went through the motions of religious life without any of the interior fire that was supposed to animate it. Teresa saw this as the same disease. Whether you were a nun reciting the divine office without attention, or a husband and wife sharing a bed without intimacy, you were doing the same thing. You were performing the shell of something while the living center had quietly departed. And you had made your peace with that departure in a way that Teresa considered almost worse than open rebellion, because at least open rebellion is honest about what is missing. She wrote that the soul can become numb just as the body does. A hand left in cold water long enough stops registering the cold. A heart that has stopped being tended stops registering its own hunger. And the dangerous thing about this numbness is how reasonable it begins to feel. You start to think, this is just what long relationships are. This is just what life is. Everyone around you seems to be living the same way. The surface conversations, the managed evenings, the bodies in the same room, and the minds somewhere entirely separate. You start to think you are the normal one. Teresa called that normalization the last trap, because once you have accepted the numbness as the standard, you stop reaching, you stop asking, you stop leaning toward the other person in the small, daily, almost invisible ways that keep a relationship genuinely alive. And the other person, feeling no lean toward them, leans back too. And then there are two people in perfect equilibrium, neither one reaching, neither one receiving, and both of them wondering, in the private silence they have each constructed, whether this is all there was ever going to be. She writes in The Interior Castle, composed when she was 62 years old and had 40 years of observing human beings behind her, that the soul has many rooms. She uses a castle as the central image of the human interior, and she says that most people spend their lives in the outer rooms, near the entrance, close to the noise and the surface and the demands of daily life. They never move inward, never risk the silence of the deeper rooms, where things get uncomfortable and true. She applies this to marriage explicitly. A couple who lives entirely in the outer rooms of their own souls cannot truly meet each other. They can coexist, they can manage, they can perform all the external rituals of a shared life, but they cannot actually reach each other because they have not reached themselves. This was radical in 1577. It is still radical now. Because what Teresa is saying is that the work of a relationship begins not with the other person, but with your own willingness to go inward, to do the uncomfortable, inconvenient work of knowing what you actually feel, what you actually want, what you're actually afraid of, and then, from that place of genuine self-knowledge, to turn toward your partner and attempt real contact. Not the managed surface version, the actual thing. Now here is where the documented record gets specific in a way that is easy to miss if you are reading Teresa quickly. In the letters she exchanged with her brother Lorenzo de Cepeda between 1570 and 1576, Teresa repeatedly addresses his questions about his own family life after his return from the Americas. Lorenzo had been in Peru for decades. He came back to Spain in 1575 with money, with children, with the shape of a life, but the feeling, he told his sister, that he did not quite know how to inhabit it. He felt strange in his own house, like a guest in rooms that were supposed to be his. Teresa's responses to him are some of the most practically specific things she ever wrote. She tells him to stop waiting to feel at home and to start making small, deliberate choices to be present. She tells him that intimacy is not something that returns on its own, like weather. It is rebuilt, she says, one small, honest moment at a time. One real question instead of a surface one. One admission of uncertainty instead of a performance of confidence. She's also concrete about what not to do. She tells Lorenzo not to perform cheerfulness he does not feel, because the people who live closest to you always know the difference. They may not name it, they may not call you on it, but they feel the distance between the version of you that shows up and the one that is actually inside you, and they adjust accordingly. They pull back a little. They decide, without deciding, that the real you is not quite available, and eventually they stop looking for it. Teresa had a phrase she returned to across multiple letters and chapters: the counterfeit peace of managed appearances. She meant the specific exhaustion of living as a curated version of yourself inside your own home. Around strangers, you might manage this. Around colleagues, you might sustain it. But around the person who sees you every morning and every night across years and decades, the management required is enormous, and it costs something. It costs the possibility of being actually known. And being actually known, she wrote, is the only thing that makes close proximity worth bearing. She writes to him, do not speak of things you do not mean, and do not stay silent about things that burn in you. Both are a kind of lie, and lies between people who love each other turn into walls faster than any argument would. Walls faster than any argument. That line has lived in Carmelite scholarship for 4.5 centuries for a reason. She was also, and this is crucial, completely unsentimental about the role of suffering in close relationships. She did not believe that pain in a marriage was a sign of failure. She believed it was, in many cases, the very mechanism through which two people could either go deeper or go numb. The choice, she said, was always available, even late, even after years of numbness, even after the silence had grown so large and so familiar that it felt like the floor of the house. In the summer of 1572, Teresa was in her late 50s and serving as prioress at the Convent of the Incarnation. This was a difficult posting. The convent was financially struggling. The community was fractured. And Teresa, despite being one of the most famous religious figures in Spain at the time, was dealing with it by showing up every day and doing the small, unglamorous work of rebuilding trust one conversation at a time. She wrote to her friend and confessor, Father Jerome Gratian, that the secret to any community, whether a convent or a family, was the same. People have to feel that they are actually seen by the people who claim to love them. If they do not feel seen, she wrote, they will eventually stop showing up. Not physically, they will still be there, but the part of them that is most real will retreat somewhere safe, and you will find yourself living with a ghost. Living with a ghost. If that phrase lands somewhere uncomfortable for you, that is probably the point. Because Teresa was not writing poetry. She was describing something she had witnessed in dozens of relationships across decades of pastoral work. She was describing what happens when two people give up on the project of knowing each other and settle instead for the convenience of proximity. Subscribe if this kind of material matters to you, because more documented spiritual and historical research like this is what we do here. Comment your city below. And know that what we just covered draws from Francisco de Ribera's biography of Teresa, written just 14 years after her death in 1582, one of the earliest and most detailed primary accounts of her life and teachings, and from the critical edition of the Book of Her Life edited by Otger Stegink and Efren de la Madre de Dios, published by the Biblioteca de Autores Cristianos in 1986, which cross-references over 60 manuscript variations to establish what Teresa actually wrote versus what was altered by early censors. These are not popularizations. These are the closest things to Teresa's own voice we have. Now back to the information. The modern silence between couples is often disguised as busyness. Everyone is tired. Everyone has screens. Everyone has obligations that expand to fill every quiet moment before it becomes uncomfortable. Teresa would have recognized this immediately. She wrote extensively about distraction as a spiritual strategy, the way the human mind will fill itself with noise rather than face the discomfort of genuine quiet. She called it the soul running from itself. And she said it was just as easy to run inside a relationship. In fact, she said it was easier, because when you are alone, the emptiness is obvious and you have to reckon with it. When you are with another person, you can always manufacture enough activity and conversation to avoid the moment when something real would have to happen. Two people can build an entire life out of avoidance. They can be, by every external measure, a functioning couple, and by every internal measure, two isolated individuals sharing coordinates. Teresa's proposed remedy is not complicated, but it is not easy. She called it recollection, which in her usage meant the practice of gathering yourself back from the surface of things and returning to your interior. She recommended it as a daily practice, not a weekly one, and she applied it to relationships directly. You cannot offer what you have not found in yourself. You cannot connect to another person's depth if you have never visited your own. She was specific about the practical shape of this. She told people to spend time each day in genuine silence, not distracted silence, not the silence of exhaustion in front of a fire while your mind races, but actual interior quiet, long enough to notice what was actually happening inside them, what they actually felt, what they actually feared, and then from that clarity to return to the people they loved and try again. Not a dramatic declaration, not a confrontation, just a real question, just a moment of looking at the person sitting across from you as if you have not already decided who they are. Teresa knew this was against every instinct of a tired, busy, settled human being. She knew that routine is comfortable, that predictability feels like safety, that the effort of genuine attention to another person, especially one you have lived with for years, requires a kind of energy that most people would rather spend elsewhere. She did not make it sound easy. She made it sound necessary. In her conversations with the Toledo woman, the one who felt she was living with a man she had met once and forgotten to keep meeting, Teresa reportedly asked her a single question that the woman described as changing everything she had thought about her marriage. Teresa asked her, "When did you last ask your husband something you genuinely did not know the answer to?" Not a practical question, not a question about the household or the children or the plans for the following week. A question born from real curiosity, about who he was, about what he thought about when he was quiet, about what frightened him that he had never said aloud. The woman reportedly could not answer. She sat there in Teresa's receiving room at the convent of Saint Joseph in Avila, and she could not think of a single time in recent memory when she had asked her husband something she genuinely wanted to know. Think about that for a moment. 14 years, thousands of shared meals, thousands of shared nights, the births of children together, the burying of losses together, the management of a household and a social circle and a faith life, and not one question born from genuine curiosity. Not one moment of turning toward him and thinking, I wonder, I genuinely wonder. Not a question that already had an assumed answer. Not a conversation started to fill the silence, but real, alive curiosity about who this person actually was at this particular moment in their lives. The gap between going through the motions and actually being there is not a dramatic gap. That is what makes it so easy to fall into. It is a millimeter gap, repeated 10,000 times. Teresa let the silence sit. Then she said something that the woman recorded years later in her own account of the conversation. Teresa said, "If you have stopped being curious about him, you have stopped loving him. What you are maintaining now is a habit. Habits are comfortable. But you did not marry him to be comfortable. You married him because he was, at some moment, genuinely surprising to you. Go find that again. Go ask him something real." That instruction, go ask him something real, sounds absurdly simple. And it is simple. It is also one of the most difficult things any human being can do after years of accumulated routine and assumption and unspoken grievance. Because asking a real question means admitting you do not know. And admitting you do not know means the person across from you might answer in a way that surprises you. And being surprised by the person you have lived with for a decade means accepting that you have not, in fact, fully known them. That the neat, finished portrait you had drawn of them in your head was always a projection, always partial, always, in some ways, wrong. That is terrifying. It is also, according to Teresa of Avila, the only direction in which love can go to stay alive. She also addressed the particular cruelty of contempt. Not dramatic contempt, not cruelty or hatred. The small daily contempt that grows in long relationships. The eye roll. The correction in front of others. The way one person finishes the other's sentences, not because they are attuned to each other, but because they have decided the other person is predictable and their own version is better. The way fondness slowly curdles into irritation until you cannot remember what it felt like before. Teresa called this the theft of dignity, and she was fierce about it. She wrote that every person carries an interior worth that is not diminished by familiarity, and that treating someone as if you have seen all there is to see is one of the deepest failures of charity possible between people who have promised each other their lives. She had observed that contempt, once established in a relationship, becomes a lens, Once you have decided that the other person is boring, or weak, or predictable, or insufficient, you begin to interpret everything they do through that lens. Their strengths become invisible. Their efforts become invisible. Only the evidence confirming your judgment gets through. And the person being viewed through that lens, even if they cannot name what is happening, can feel it. They can feel when they have stopped being seen as fully human by the person they share their life with. They withdraw. They become careful. They perform a smaller, safer version of themselves, and then the first person sees that smaller version and thinks, yes, this is exactly what I expected. And the loop closes. Here is the part that is easy to miss. Teresa writes that contempt is rarely conscious. The people who fall into it do not typically wake up one morning and decide to stop respecting their partner. It happens in the small, accumulated choices that nobody notices. The choice not to ask. The choice not to listen when the answer comes. The choice to decide what someone means before they finish speaking. The choice to tell the story of your life together, to yourself and to others, in a way that positions you as the more perceptive one, the more patient one, the one who carries more of the weight. Each of these choices, individually, seems harmless. Together, over years, they constitute a kind of verdict. A quiet, private ruling that the person you are living with is less than you once hoped for, less than you deserved, and that this disappointment has become the permanent texture of your shared life. Teresa wrote that she had watched this happen to people who genuinely started out in love, who had been, in the beginning, astonished by each other, who had looked at each other across a room and felt something bright and specific, and then, gradually, had decided they knew what that brightness was, had cataloged it, filed it, and stopped expecting to be surprised by it. And in that decision, they had extinguished it, not because it was not still there, but because they had stopped looking for it. Teresa named this loop in 1577, without those words, without any of the vocabulary of modern relational psychology. She named it because she had watched it happen, in couples and in communities, over and over and over again. And she said the only way to break it was for someone to go first, to choose, against every accumulated instinct and grievance, to look at the other person as if you had never quite seen them before, to approach them with the beginner's eye. She did not say this was romantic. She said it was an act of will, a choice made in the absence of feeling, when the feeling is nowhere to be found, and made anyway, because love is not a temperature you either have or don't. It is, she wrote, a direction you choose to walk in. Walking towards someone who has become a stranger to you. Walking towards someone who has maybe also decided you're already known and fully understood and slightly disappointing. Walking toward them anyway, with a real question and an open hand. That is, in Teresa's architecture, one of the bravest things a human being can do. Now, here is what makes this even more striking when you look at the documented record. Teresa herself never married. She never lived inside a long-term domestic partnership, and yet she was consulted by married women and men across Spain with a frequency that her confessors found remarkable. They came to the convent at St. Joseph in Avila. They wrote to her across distances of 400 kilometers. They sought her out at convents in Salamanca, in Valladolid, in Toledo, and in Seville. Between 1562, when she founded the first Reformed Carmelite community, in 1582, the year of her death, she founded 17 convents and traveled thousands of kilometers across Spain's rough roads, most of it by cart, in conditions that would test anyone half her age. And at every stop, people came to her not just with religious questions, but with questions about the people they lived with, about how to keep caring, about how to find their way back to someone who had become unfamiliar. She answered them all the same way. Go inward first, then go toward them. In the years after Teresa's death in October of 1582 in the town of Alba de Tormes, the women who had been formed by her and the communities that carried her influence continued to document the practical effects of her teachings on the lives of ordinary people. The Carmelite archive in Rome holds letters from the early 1600s in which women describe, in plain language, the specific changes they made in their marriages after encountering Teresa's ideas. The changes are almost always small. A different quality of attention at dinner. A question asked at the end of the day that was not about logistics. A moment of choosing to stay in the conversation instead of retreating to routine. Small things, consistently chosen. One letter, written around 1610 by a woman identified only as a resident of Burgos, describes what happened after she began practicing what she called Teresa's way of looking. She writes that she started each morning by spending 15 minutes in silence, not with any religious formality, just quiet, asking herself what she actually felt and what she actually wanted. And then she would go downstairs to her husband and she would look at him, she wrote, as if he were someone she had not quite met yet. She reports that within 3 months, her husband began asking her questions he had never asked before, not because she had told him what she was doing, just because she was actually there in a way she had not been for years. And something in her presence called something forward in him. She wrote, I did not change him. I changed what I brought to the room, and that changed everything. Teresa would have recognized that immediately. It was exactly what she had spent 40 years teaching. That is the structure of what Teresa was describing. Not a dramatic renovation of a relationship, not a retreat or crisis or confrontation that clears the air, just the daily, deliberate choice to remain present, to remain curious, to refuse the comfortable numbness of a life lived on the surface next to someone you have decided to stop truly meeting. She was 67 years old when she died. She had founded 17 convents. She had written works that 440 years later are still read by scholars and ordinary people alike. She had been declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970, the first woman to receive that title, alongside Saint Catherine of Siena. And she had done all of it while simultaneously paying exquisite attention to the small daily mechanics of how human beings either stay connected to each other or quietly fall away. What is remarkable, when you trace the documented record, is how much of her energy went not toward the famous and the powerful, but toward ordinary people and ordinary struggles. There are letters to merchants, letters to a woman whose son had died, letters to a man who wrote to her in 1574 describing what sounds almost exactly like what we would now call depression, a heaviness that would not lift, a flatness, a sense that the life he was living had stopped being fully inhabited. Teresa's response to him runs to 3 full pages in the critical edition, and it is unlike anything you would expect from a 16th century nun. She does not tell him to pray more. She does not tell him his suffering is God's will, and he should accept it. She tells him to go outside every day, to eat, to sleep, to speak to people about things that are not theological. She tells him that the soul cannot operate well in a body that is being neglected. And she tells him that the first step out of the fog is not a spiritual discipline, but the simple, daily decision to show up for the people in front of him, even when he feels nothing. Her last recorded words, spoken in the convent at Alba de Tormes in the early hours of October 4th, 1582, were reported by the sisters present as an expression of gratitude and belonging. Not drama, not vision, just gratitude, spoken quietly in a room full of people who had genuinely known her. That is the ending she chose. Or rather, that is the ending she spent a lifetime building. A room full of people who knew her, really knew her, not a life lived in comfortable silence, not a roster of people who had shared her space without ever quite reaching her, but genuine witness, genuine presence, the fruit of a lifetime of refusing the false peace of going through the motions and insisting, in its place, on the difficult, alive, worth-it work of being truly with another person. The woman from Toledo, the one who could not remember the last time she had asked her husband a real question, reportedly went home from her meeting with Teresa, and, that evening, sat down across from her husband and asked him something she had never asked in 14 years of marriage. The specific question is not recorded. What is recorded, in her own account, preserved in the archive of the convent of St. Joseph in Avila, is what happened when she asked it. He looked at her, she wrote, as if he was seeing me for the first time in years. And she realized, in that moment, that she had been invisible. Not because he had stopped looking, but because she had stopped showing up. She showed up that night. And he answered. And the silence between them, for the first time and longer than either of them could name, was not empty. It was full. That archive still exists. The convent of St. Joseph in Avila still stands. And in the collection of letters and testimonies held there, among correspondence dated between 1562 and the early 1600s, there are accounts of ordinary married people who came to Teresa or to her communities with the oldest question in the world: how do you stay close to someone you have already chosen? And what they found there, 4.5 centuries ago, was not a formula or a program or a list of steps. They found a woman who had looked directly at the human soul in all of its avoidance and longing and quiet desperation, and told the truth about what she saw. The truth is this: the silence between two people who live together and feel like strangers is never just the silence of indifference. Underneath it, almost always, is the silence of someone who stopped believing the reaching was worth the risk, and almost always on both sides. Teresa of Avila's entire life was a sustained argument against that belief. The reaching, she said, is always worth it. The only question is who goes first.